Saturnine Terminators were first revealed. The fandom practically split like a Land Raider, hitting full speed into a Warlord Titan. Some called them too chunky, others hailed them as the most loyal homage to the Horus Heresy's darkest hours we've seen yet. Heavier, meaner, and bristling with Baroque armor plating, these behemoths were forged in the fires of narrative nostalgia. And I think Games Workshop did a great job with these designs. Yes, they look silly in a way, but in a time when most of 40k looks a little sterile and tacticool, the Saturnine design stands out to me in a good way. Completely over the top and maybe a little silly, like 40k used to be in the beginning. And their silliness is strangely satisfying when every Space Marine release feels similar. These chunky lands are Space Marines, alright, but because they look so different it becomes refreshing. And I already have a giant case of FOMO as I look at all these artworks: Iron Warriors, Thousand Suns, White Scars, even Ultramarines look great. I want to paint them all, I guess because this is just a fantastic new and different base model to try on all of these color schemes that we know so well. But before that, I want to give the official Salamander scheme a shot, probably mainly because the fire pattern on the shoulders is a little genius and I want to try and replicate it really bad. But since I'm not in the Good Boys Club anymore, the time between the announcement of the box and actually being able to get my hands on the models felt like ages. But once it arrived and I got over how many parts it takes to assemble a single Terminator, I assembled one right away. Before getting started on painting, I wanted to understand what was going on in the official paint jobs, so I could decide what to do with my own version. It looks like they started from an olive green, maybe Castellan green or Caliban green. And then the shading is usually done by adding Rhinox high and glazing the dark areas down gradually. Although some parts look a bit more like a dark turquoise, maybe Incubate Darkness was involved. And then the highlights looked like they were painted by adding some yellow beige and finally a very bright beige on the last highlights. Now, I realized that the Horus Heresy's Salamander scheme deviates a bit from the traditional 40k Salamander's colors, but personally I wanted to start from a green that was slightly more reminiscent of the latest scheme. And while it's technically not lore accurate, it's accurate for I don't own any Caliban green. So I took Guardian green by the Army Painter and blasted it through the airbrush, right over the black base coat. You can of course do this using a brush, or a makeup sponge will be very fast too, but honestly, if you paint a lot, you will not regret grabbing an airbrush. I'm using my gallery budget setup, works just as great as my more expensive Iwata Eclipse, and hundreds of people have already picked one up through my affiliate link, and I have yet to hear of someone that regrets their choice. I'm always super tempted to do some pre-shading with the airbrush during this step. It's such a smooth look, and every time I run my spray pattern along the alignment of these cylinders, you can see I'm clearly thinking of it. But instead, I wanted to show you how to create smooth blends and some proper shading with a brush and without much effort, similar to what the Heavy Metal team did on the official paint job. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, so let me unpack it. While I'm picking out areas I want to shade, I definitely want to mention that while I'm somewhat trying to replicate the box art, I'm not necessarily shading the same way. Sure, while it's kind of obvious to darken the lower part of the armor here, since well, it's facing down. And features like the eagle need some dark separation from the rest of the armor. Most panels on the official paint job are shaded just downward. You can see that I try to respect the shapes a bit more, especially as I work on the armor of the upper legs, which is cylindrical. And that's why I leave the middle brighter and vertically shade the outsides. And this creates light reflections that you would see on a real metal cylinder. Obviously, the shinier the metal, the more pronounced and the more separated these lines would be. But the idea stays the same. So now we established where I decided to shade, but what is left to unpack is how am I doing it? One could say which technique am I using and what color is it? As you can see, I'm pushing the paint towards the area I want darker, away from the parts I want to keep bright. That way the pigment settles more in the areas where I take the brush off the mini. Learning and practicing how paint behaves, how it comes off the brush, but also how much you should load the brush, how much you should dilute the paint and so on is key here, but more on that in a bit. And remember when I said Games Workshop likes to shade most of their marines with mixes of the main color and Rhinox hide? Here I tried something similar. I mixed Guardian Green with Burnished Red, which is a red-brown speed paint by the Army Painter. And speed paint, just like contrast paint as you might know, is transparent, which means this mix will also be a little less opaque than pure regular acrylic paint, which helps tremendously with blending. And the consistency also changes slightly, but I'll get back to that in a bit. So you can see this mix can be used like a wash for relatively simple tasks, like settle in the recesses I put you in. Would you please? And at the same time, it's also great for more controlled dark line, like here on the leg armor. Now, I could build layers gradually by glazing to get really smooth transitions, but there's a much quicker way. So you can see that I'm basically sketching in the parts I want dark by putting relatively undiluted layers into these areas, and then later smooth out the transitions once these solid layers have dried. Whenever there's straight surfaces that meet at an angle, it's always a great way to define these by putting the darkest area of one surface right next to the brightest part of the adjacent area. And that's what I'm also doing while sketching here. The Army Painter reached out to me a while ago to sponsor a video, but I wanted to wait until it would really make sense. They didn't give me any talking points, they just said, do whatever you want, just paint something cool using our paints. And they can do that because they know I think highly of their products, because I know they have high standards and I know they work, so they don't have to tell me what to say. Which in turn should give you the confidence that I'm not just making things up. When I say good things about their paints and products, then that's because I tried them and used them regularly. Like their speed paint medium or their airbrush medium that I'm using to thin practically everything I shoot through my airbrush. So why did I decide to use them as a sponsor for this video? Well, one thing that is always a bit tricky when creating somewhat educational painting content like I try to do is to make it as easy as possible for viewers at home to replicate what I do. And all of that starts with having easy access to similar or identical colors. So I asked the Army Painter to create a bundle for all the essential paints I'm using in this tutorial, and you can find a link to that down in the description. It's basically a bundle of 12 paints. You only will have to add black and white, but I'm assuming you have that already. And then there's one optional color, but we will get to that at the end of the video. As I keep adding shadows, you can see that I switch between a couple of approaches. We already talked about pigment pushing and establishing the dark areas with a solid layer before smoothing out the gradient. But I'm also sometimes smoothing a fresh layer by cleaning my brush and then just wiping it across the edge of the layer to feather out the pigments with just water. What also works is having a dry brush, and that's a dry brush, not a dry brush, on standby to dab on the edges of the layers to soak up a bit of that paint and at the same time rub some of the pigment into the surface. This is a really fun technique, kind of like you would blend oil paint on a Mini, and I found this works particularly well with the Army Painter's speed paints. It's just a fun way to blend together layers if you want to try it out sometime. And as you can see, I keep combining these techniques to gradually define all the shapes, building that very deep red shadow on my green base color. And all of this takes a while, and it's definitely not a speed painting technique, but it gives a really close result to what Games Workshop did on their salamanders. Once I was done, I took a minute to analyze the result, and I think I really like the reddish shadow on the green. Not only are the transitions smooth enough, the shadows look deep and define the Mini really well. The subtly visible red tone will later work really well with the red in the shoulders and the metallic parts of the Mini. And next, to bring a bit more saturation back in the green highlights, I went back to Guardian Green and applied a few layers. Mixing it to a glaze consistency also allows me to smooth out any transition that might have ended up a little rougher. All I do is work over these transitions, again by pushing pigments away from darker areas towards the areas I want brighter. And using Guardian Green again, I'm also starting to work on edge highlights. This puts a lot more emphasis on the shadows because that brighter line frames up every dark part. Also, because I want to somewhat stick to the heavy metal approach, I make sure that these first highlights are a little thicker than the subsequent ones. That softens them and smooths them out visually as we look at them. Here's a little trick I picked up a while ago for these lines that Games Workshop puts within panels, like on shoulder pads of Space Marines or here on these panels on the legs. I guess you could call them inverted edge highlights. I guess ultimately they're just there to define these parts a bit more and make them more interesting. In any case, what I do when I paint them is I take the trim as a guide for my brush. So you can see that I rest the broad side of the bristles on that edge and then just drag the brush across. That way the tip leaves a very even and straight line. And yeah, no idea why, but for some reason edge highlighting always just feels really satisfying. For the next step I was using green skin. It's a really good fit for both 40k salamanders, I think, but also to set up the last two highlights in the 30K scheme, which makes the end result look more olive green or even yellow. And as I said, I'm trying to cover less area and I just keep on framing all elements with simple lines. On the helmet, however, I'm painting a bit of a wider highlight to draw more attention in the end result. Almost like more light would be accumulating there. At this stage, I'm also setting up some battle damage, like larger dents and more surface level scratches. So I'm painting these wider dots where the chips will go and some thin lines with the very tip of the brush. And then also some very small dots to add a bit of extra surface detail. And I'm trying to think which areas will be more exposed and focus the detailing on these parts. But I'm also making an effort to put detail in darker areas, simply because the bright color has a bigger impact there. So yes, at this point you could argue this looks a little too much like 40K salamanders, at least if half your sentences start with actually. And like I said, I consciously went for a richer green base color, but adding yellow to the green skin at this point would make this look a little closer to the more olive pattern the salamanders have in the 30K setting. So I tried to paint even smaller lines with this highlight than the one before, but I wasn't too worried if I covered a little of the earlier work. This is usually when the heavy metal style becomes really time intense and I don't want to spend too much time. What I tried to do to offset this is hitting the areas like apex points of curves more, or corners where edges meet, or have sharp angle changes. And then whenever possible, I try to drag just the broad side of the brush along the edges to create sharp and thin lines. I also kept working on that main reflection on the helmet, and I put a little more emphasis and detail work into more exposed areas like the fingers and the side of the legs. Ultimately, I put some imp yellow in just the corners of a lot of these features. It's just a simple way of pushing the contrast without a lot of effort or risk of covering too much that you painted before, when for example trying to push that highlight on every edge. And that way there's just a tiny pixel in that corner and it still makes all the difference. I grabbed the very dark brown speed paint and put small dots into the brighter spots I set up earlier with the green. This was my way to create some interesting chipping, and it saved me the trouble of fiddling around with painting in bright edges after putting on dark chipping, which is always the harder approach. Oh, and I simply use the speed paint because it gives me a bit more control over the size of the chips because of the higher surface tension. It also stays workable longer, and it just comes off of the brush more easily than regular acrylics. Next I started working on the shoulders and I tried two different approaches here. One with the airbrush and the other one with a makeup sponge as a budget version. I'll let you decide which one ended up looking better. So for the airbrush approach, I first masked off everything I have done so far in order not to have it damaged in case of an airbrush mishap. And then I added a layer of white, just so that my colors will look a bit more intense. And on top of that I sprayed Flickering Flame, which is a bright orange, and that looked a bit bright, but during the next step it would get toned down. Now to keep the intensity while adding the next step I used Bright Red, which is a speed paint and therefore transparent. So layering this on top of the orange created a great gradient right away. I just needed one more darker layer towards the top, so I sprayed on Burnished Red, which was the color I used to shade the greens before, and then started to paint on the dried lava patch pattern. Started from a few smaller patches near the teleport transponder and then gradually made them bigger. Also you can see that I leave wider cracks initially so I can get the rough layer right before I refine and make the cracks smaller. To build the patterns, I'm mostly sticking to hexagons and pentagons that I squish and stretch whenever I need to fill some space or I don't have enough space. And after the pattern was established, I made the crack lines smaller and thinning out more towards the top so it looks like fading and, well, a little bit like sizzling flames too, which I think was the intention in the official paint jobs. And since pure black looks a little jarring on minis, I applied a few layers of burnished red that tones down the black and also softens out the transitions between the patches and the cracks. The idea here is that the heat from below would still radiate out between the patches and create some air flickering. But also the edges of the patches would most likely still be hotter than the center, so these parts would blur a little into red. So after I picked out a few of the brighter areas with some pure fiendish yellow, I also outlined most patches with some burnished red for the same effect. I gave the panel a quick gray outline using my trim trick again, and then also added a bit of gray highlights to the patches to add some three-dimensionality and depth. And since not everyone has an airbrush, here's another quick way to build the fiery gradient. Using this 10-cent makeup sponge, I started by building a layer of orange paint the same way I did with the airbrush. And here's where the army painter colors shine, because 2 layers of this was enough to cover right over the black primer while still looking intense and bright. Now I built the gradient with the same colors I used for the airbrush version. So next up I dabbed on bright red speed paint, and this worked really great. Just one caveat. You need to stop and give this first layer a little time to dry, else this happens and you rub the paint right off again. Luckily, you can fill that right in with another layer after the first one was dry, and I blended the bright orange with the red, dipping the sponge into water before picking up paint and giving it one pass with thinned down bright red, followed by a diluted layer of flickering flame. At the top, as usually, I added a last layer of burnished red and then proceeded to paint the patches the same way I already explained. I don't really see much difference in the results, but you let me know. I'm painting every surface I want to be some form of metal and silver. Even the parts I later plan to be golden, like the chest eagle and the shoulder trims. For the steel metals, I use a mix of satchel brown and burnished red to stain the silver, letting it run into recesses and also darkening the panels and connective parts of the armor. I do this a couple of times until the staining is dark enough for my taste, and at last I add some black to the recesses I wanted even darker in a more controlled way, and then proceeded to highlight and define the edges again with pure silver. I covered all gold parts in an initial layer of sand golem, which is a saturated yellow that's a perfect base for a rich gold. And then I gradually added different speed paints to the yellow, ruddy fur and burnished red when I wanted more desaturated brown tones, like on the chest eagle, and the little bright red when I wanted more orange tones, like on the shoulder trims. And really, I just mix and match, adapting on the spot, depending on if I want more saturation or darker parts and so on. I just always make sure to leave some of the yellow exposed so it still kind of reads like gold. And once I'm happy with the gradients and tints, I'm grabbing tinted gold, which has become my go-to highlight color for anything that's gold, simply because it fits all kinds of golds. In an earlier video I explained how it almost feels like it's adapting to whatever the base color is. I guess ultimately it's just a really bright, slightly yellow-green tinted color that just harmonizes with a lot of orange and red and brown tone. And hey, not everything has to make sense logically, as long as it works. So of course I'm highlighting edges, and then I take some areas up a lot more in brightness than others, like the chest eagle, and then I'm keeping a lot more of the rich colors in the shoulder trims and just pick out selected areas with really thin down layers of tainted gold. When I did the lenses, I wanted to do something similar to the official paint jobs again, and what they did this time is build a ring around the lens evenly, and then build a round highlight in the top 2/3 of the circle. So I did exactly that and highlighted that up to a similar desaturated orange by gradually adding more and more imp yellow to my base red. And I treated the eye lenses in a similar way, just with a more traditional pattern. Like when I first saw the trailer and the actual models, I knew I wanted to replicate the intense glow on the teleportation transponders and the plasma coils of the weapons. And the first step of that is to build a bright canvas to work off of on these elements. So I covered them in white, and you can use whatever white you like. Oil paints and acrylic inks flow a bit better into the recesses, but need a few more layers. Regular acrylics have a bit more coverage, but don't flow as good. In my opinion, there's no perfect paint for this, but once I have this initial white layer done, I'm building a bit of a halo effect around the features by airbrushing on a mist of white. And I think this is a really important step with most OSL, and the airbrush is just the best tool for that, even though you can kind of replicate it with a sponge. I followed this up by a few shots of fluorescent yellow right into the middle of all the parts. which would later modulate the blue I plan to use to have an even brighter and hotter feeling effect on the eye. Then I was grabbing plasmatic bold speed paint, kind of nice but army painted to name the paint appropriately for its use, and covered everything else that was still white, including the white halo glow. And this is the optional color I was talking about initially that is not in the bundle, linked in the description. So if you want to do a similar OSL effect, you will have to add this paint manually to your shopping cart. And I guess also some kind of yellow flue paint. This already looks great, but we need the white back to make it look glowing hot again. However, we don't want to cover too much with the white, and make sure some turquoise color tint is still showing. So now I'm mixing a little white oil paint with white spirit and let that flow into the recesses. I use oil paint because of the flow, but also because I can wipe away any excess with white spirit and a makeup sponge or a Q-tip. And then I had to make some of these areas that are supposed to be cooler, darker again. So I'm gradually adding bits of black to the plasmatic bold and carefully touch these areas that I wanted darker up until I was happy with the results. And last but not least, I added a Salamanders decal. Once I had it transferred and softened it a bit with microsole, it was thin enough to add a few scratches and chips by scraping away material with a steel needle. And of course the base had to be painted, but I just added some grey dry brushing like they did in the original. So yeah, opinions on the Saturnine Terminators are divided. Some people hate them, some people love them. Personally, I find them at least a little goofy, and the kits also look like we will have a bit of a hard time making them truly unique with how difficult it seems to get a variety of poses out of them. But I really enjoy these wacky giant suits of armor with shoulders that even the 80s could not handle. And I'm already painting another one in an Iron Warriors pattern, and I really like having something different, some different shapes, something bigger than even a regular Terminator that has large surfaces to work with, that allows for all kinds of freehands, different patterns, weathering, or even loads of heraldry to plaster on, and yet isn't as big as a Dreadnought that I would never finish just because it's so large. In any case, let me know how you like the result and keep pushing that pigment. Until next time, see you soon with more Horus Heresy.